Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
I thought I'd buried the past so deep that nothing could dig it up again. 15 years of careful reconstruction, of building a new life brick by brick, and then she appeared in my inbox like a ghost I never wanted to see again. Janet, the woman who destroyed everything I thought I knew about love and trust. The subject line was simple enough. Please read this. But my hands shook as I opened it, and by the time I finished reading her short, cryptic message, my carefully ordered world felt like it was tilting off its axis once more. Back when I was younger and naiver, I believed Janet was the answer to every prayer I'd never thought to say. We met at a company mixer, and she had this way of lighting up a room just by walking into it. Smart as a whip, beautiful in a way that made other men envious, and with a laugh that could make the worst day bearable. I was head over heels before I even knew what hit me. We married after 2 years of dating, and for nearly a decade, I convinced myself we were building something that would last forever. I worked myself to the bone as a construction project manager, pulling 60-hour weeks and taking every overtime opportunity that came my way. Janet deserved nice things, I told myself. She deserved the house with the big yard, the vacations to places she'd dreamed about, the security that came with financial stability. Looking back now, I can see how blind I was to the warning signs. The way she'd suddenly become protective of her phone, angling it away from me when she texted. How she started staying out later with her girlfriends, sometimes not coming home until well past midnight. The gradual cooling between us in bed. The way our conversations became more functional and less intimate. I made excuses for all of it. Work was stressing her out. She needed space to decompress with her friends. Maybe I was being too clingy, too demanding of her time. So I backed off thinking I was being understanding when really I was just giving her more room to betray me. The truth came out on a Thursday evening in October. I'd been at the office late reviewing blueprints when I realized I'd left my reading glasses at home. The house was supposed to be empty. Janet had said she was having dinner with her sister across town. But when I pulled into the driveway, I could see lights on in the living room and heard voices through the front door. I walked in expecting to find her watching TV or maybe chatting with a neighbor who'd stopped by. Instead, I found her curled up on our couch with a man I'd met exactly once at one of her work parties. His name was Kevin, and his hands were tangled in her hair while she laughed at something he'd whispered in her ear. They looked so comfortable together, so natural, like they'd been doing this for months, which, as it turned out, they had been. The confrontation that followed was surreal. I stood there in my own living room, watching my wife scramble to explain why another man's arms were around her, and the best she could come up with was that I'd stopped making her feel special. Kevin, meanwhile, just sat there looking sheepish, but not particularly sorry. I didn't yell or throw things like you see in movies. I was too stunned for that kind of dramatic reaction. I just asked the obvious questions. How long? Why? What was she planning to do now? Janet answered with the kind of clinical honesty that hurt worse than any screaming match could have. They'd been seeing each other for 8 months. She felt more alive with him than she had with me in years. And yes, she wanted a divorce. Just like that, nearly 10 years of marriage dissolved into paperwork and division of assets. The months that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I moved into a cramped apartment across town and spent most evenings staring at walls, trying to make sense of how thoroughly I'd misread my own life. Janet got the house, since she could afford the payments with Kevin's help, and I got the debt from all those vacations and improvements I'd thought were investments in our future. Therapy helped, eventually. So did time, and the gradual realization that maybe our marriage had been failing long before Kevin entered the picture. I started my own contracting business, which gave me something to focus on besides my wounded pride. And after a few years of being determinedly single, I met Grace at a community gardening project. She was patient, kind, and nothing like Janet in all the ways that mattered. We'd been together for over a decade when Janet's email arrived, and I'd honestly believed I was done with that chapter of my life. Grace knew the whole story, of course, but we rarely talked about my ex-wife anymore. Why would we? Janet was ancient history, a cautionary tale from my younger, more foolish days. Except now she was back, asking to meet, claiming she had something important to tell me that couldn't be shared over email. My first instinct was to delete the message and pretend it never happened. My second was to forward it to Grace and ask her what she thought I should do. Grace surprised me with her response. "Maybe you should hear her out," she said, not looking up from the tomato plants she was tending in our backyard. "Not because you owe her anything, but because you might need to know what she wants to say." I thought about that for 3 days before finally responding to Janet's email. I kept it brief and businesslike, agreeing to meet but making it clear that whatever she wanted to discuss had better be worth disrupting the peace I'd worked so hard to build. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, somewhere neutral where neither of us would feel particularly comfortable or nostalgic. I got there early and chose a table near the back, where we could talk without being overheard, but where I could also keep an eye on the exits if I decided I needed to leave quickly. Janet walked in looking older than I'd expected, though I supposed 15 years would do that to anyone. Her hair was shorter now, more practical than stylish, and she moved with less of that confident stride I remembered. She looked tired, if I'm being honest, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with whatever had brought her here. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, less sure of itself. "I'm here," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, "but I'm not sure why I should be, so you'd better start talking." She fidgeted with her coffee cup, turning it in small circles on the table between us. "I need to apologize first. For everything. For the way I ended things, for the pain I caused you. I've wanted to say that for years, but I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't have. So why now?" That's when her composure started to crack. Her eyes filled with tears she clearly didn't want to shed, and her voice became unsteady. "Because I need your help, and I have no right to ask for it. But I'm desperate, and you're the only person I can think of who might—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Help with what?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "My daughter," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "She's sick, and the treatment she needs, I can't afford it. I've tried everything else." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Janet had a daughter. Of course she did. Life had moved on for both of us in the years since our divorce, but hearing her talk about her child in such desperate terms stirred up emotions I wasn't prepared for. "Where's Kevin in all this?" I asked. "Isn't he supposed to be your partner in this?" Janet's face twisted with bitterness. "Kevin left us when Emma was 3. Decided fatherhood was too much responsibility for him. I haven't seen him since. Emma. Her daughter's name was Emma, and she was sick, and Janet was asking me, the man she'd cheated on and divorced, to help save her. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who'd once told me I wasn't enough for her was now sitting across from me, tears streaming down her face, begging for my assistance because everyone else in her life had failed her. What kind of sick? I found myself asking, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Leukemia," she said, the word hanging in the air between us like a death sentence. "The doctors say her chances are good if she gets the right treatment, but the costs. Even with insurance, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was asking of me. "And you think I can just write a check for that?" "The contracting business has done well for you," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know it's a lot to ask, but Emma is innocent in all this. She doesn't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes." There it was. The guilt card, played exactly as I'd expected. But even knowing I was being manipulated, I couldn't quite shake the image of a sick child, whose only crime was having Janet as a mother. "I need to think about this," I said, standing up from the table. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make on the spot." "Please don't take too long," Janet pleaded. "Every day matters with her treatment." I left the coffee shop feeling like I was walking through quicksand. Everything I thought I'd resolved about my past was suddenly up in the air again, complicated by the introduction of an innocent child I'd never met, but who might depend on my decision for her life. Grace was waiting for me when I got home, reading in the living room we'd decorated together with furniture we'd chosen as a team. Everything about our life together was built on honesty and mutual respect, the exact opposite of what I'd had with Janet. "How did it go?" she asked, setting down her book. I told her everything, about Emma's illness, about Kevin's abandonment, about Janet's plea for help. Grace listened without interrupting, her face growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. "What are you thinking?" she asked when I finished. "I'm thinking this feels like manipulation," I said. "But I'm also thinking about a 12-year-old girl who might die if I don't help." Grace reached over and took my hand. You know I'll support whatever decision you make. But maybe the question isn't whether Janet deserves your help. Maybe it's whether you can live with yourself if you don't help Emma. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what Grace had said about the difference between helping Janet and helping her daughter. By morning, I'd made up my mind about what I needed to do next. I called Janet and told her I wanted to meet Emma before making any commitments. If I was going to involve myself in this situation, I needed to understand exactly what I was getting into. Janet agreed immediately, probably sensing that any hesitation might cost her my cooperation. We arranged to meet at the hospital where Emma was receiving treatment, in the children's cancer ward that I'd never had reason to visit before. Walking through those corridors, past rooms full of sick children and worried parents, put everything into perspective. This wasn't about Janet or our failed marriage or the grudges I'd been carrying for 15 years. This was about a little girl fighting for her life in a place no child should ever have to be. Emma was smaller than I'd expected, pale from her treatments, but with bright eyes that reminded me of Janet when we first met. She was drawing pictures at a bedside table, her concentration intense as she worked on what looked like a landscape with mountains and trees. "Emma," Janet said softly, "this is the friend I told you about, the one who might be able to help with your treatment." Emma looked up at me with curious eyes. "Are you a doctor?" "No," I said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I build things. Houses and buildings, mostly." "What are you drawing there?" "It's the place I want to go when I get better," she said, holding up her picture. "Mom says there's a lake up in the mountains, where you can see all the stars at night. I want to go there and count them all." Something about the simple hopefulness in her voice broke my heart. Here was a child facing the fight of her life, and she was making plans for the future, dreaming about star-filled skies and mountain lakes. We talked for about an hour, mostly about her art and her favorite books and the nurses who made her laugh during the scary parts of her treatment. She was funny and smart and completely unaware of the financial burden her illness was placing on her mother. To her, I was just another adult in a world full of adults, making decisions about her care. When I left the hospital that afternoon, I knew what I had to do. I called my accountant and my financial advisor to discuss liquidating some investments. I contacted the hospital's billing department to set up a payment plan that would cover Emma's immediate treatment needs, and I called Janet to let her know I was going to help, but with conditions. "I'm not doing this for you," I told her over the phone, my voice firm. "I want to be clear about that. This is for Emma, period. Don't mistake my helping her for forgiveness of what you did to me." "I understand," she said, her voice thick with relief and gratitude. "I can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me," I replied. "Just make sure she gets better." Over the following weeks, I found myself more involved in Emma's care than I'd initially planned. It started with practical things, making sure the hospital had received my payments, checking on her treatment schedule, asking Janet how she was responding to the medications. But gradually, it became something more personal. Emma seemed to enjoy my visits. I'd stop by once or twice a week, usually bringing art supplies or books I thought she might like. She was easy to talk to, curious about the world in the way that healthy children often are, but with an added awareness that came from spending too much time around sickness and hospitals. "Why don't you and Mom like each other?" she asked me one afternoon, her question catching me completely off guard. "What makes you think we don't like each other?" I deflected. "She gets all nervous when you're around," Emma said with the brutal honesty that only children can manage. "And you both talk to me more than you talk to each other." I looked across the room at Janet, who was pretending to read a magazine but obviously listening to our conversation. "Your mom and I have some history," I said carefully. "Grown-up stuff that happened before you were born. But we both care about you, and that's what matters right now." Emma seemed satisfied with that explanation, but her question stuck with me for days afterward. She was right, of course. Janet and I were awkward around each other, polite but distant, united only in our concern for Emma's well-being. It was during one of these hospital visits that Janet dropped the bombshell that changed everything. We were sitting in the family lounge while Emma napped, and Janet had been unusually quiet all afternoon. Finally, she turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was scared of how you'd react." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What now?" "Emma's birth date," she said, her voice barely audible. "When I told you she was 12, I wasn't. I wasn't being completely accurate about when she was born." I felt the world tilt again, just like it had when I'd first received her email. "What are you saying, Janet?" She was born 13 months after our divorce was finalized, she said, the words rushing out like she'd been holding them back for too long. Which means she was conceived while we were still married, I finished, my voice flat and cold. Janet nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know for sure whose daughter she was. Kevin was so convinced she was his, and I wanted to believe him because it felt cleaner that way. But as she got older, she started looking more like me, I said, staring at this woman who had just admitted to hiding the possibility that I had a daughter for over 12 years. I was going to tell you, she said desperately, but then Kevin left, and I was struggling to make ends meet, and I didn't want to complicate your life when I wasn't even sure. I stood up from my chair, needing to move, needing air, needing space to process what I'd just heard. You've known for 12 years that I might be Emma's father, and you're just telling me now? I was scared, she said, her voice breaking. I'd already destroyed your life once. I couldn't bear the thought of doing it again, especially if she turned out not to be yours. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced during our divorce. Back then, I'd been hurt and betrayed, but this was something deeper. This was about a child, possibly my child, who I'd been kept from knowing. We're doing a paternity test, I said, my voice deadly calm. Today. Right now. And if she's mine, Janet, if you've kept my daughter from me for 12 years, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you for that. The test was simple enough, a cheek swab for both Emma and me, with results promised within a week. Emma, bless her heart, thought it was all very scientific and exciting. She had no idea that the results might fundamentally alter the structure of her entire family. That week was the longest of my life. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the possibility that I had a daughter I'd never known. A daughter who was fighting for her life while I'd been living in blissful ignorance of her existence. Grace was incredible through all of it, supportive and patient, even though this development affected her life too. Whatever the results are, she told me, we'll figure it out together. When the call finally came, I was sitting in my truck outside a job site, reviewing construction schedules and trying to keep my mind occupied. The lab technician's voice was professionally neutral as she delivered the news that would reshape my entire understanding of my own life. The test confirms a biological relationship, she said. You are Emma's father. I sat in that truck for 20 minutes after hanging up, letting the reality sink in. I had a daughter, a 12-year-old daughter with leukemia who thought I was just her mother's friend, a daughter who'd been asking why her mom and I acted strange around each other, not knowing that we were her parents, trying to navigate the wreckage of a marriage that had ended before she was born. My first call was to Janet, though I could barely contain my anger long enough to speak to her. I got the results, I said when she answered. And? She asked, though we both knew what the answer was going to be. She's mine, I said. Emma is my daughter, and you've kept her from me for 12 years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, I thought she might have hung up. I know you hate me right now, she finally said, and you have every right to. But please don't take it out on Emma. She's innocent in all of this. Don't you dare, I said, my voice shaking with fury. Don't you dare lecture me about how to treat my own daughter. You lost the right to give me parenting advice when you decided to hide her existence from me. So what happens now? She asked quietly. Now, I tell Emma the truth, I said, and then we figure out how to move forward from here. That conversation with Emma was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the man she's been thinking of as her mother's friend is actually her father? How do you help a child understand that her entire sense of family has been built on a lie? I asked Janet to leave the room for this conversation. Whatever happened next needed to be between Emma and me, without her mother there to mediate or interpret. Emma, I said, sitting down beside her hospital bed, remember when we did that test last week? The one where they took samples from both of us? She nodded, looking up at me with curious eyes. Well, those tests were to find out if we're related to each other, and it turns out that we are. I'm not just your mom's friend, sweetheart. I'm your father. I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of confusion or distress, but Emma just tilted her head and studied me like she was trying to solve a puzzle. You mean you're my dad? She asked. Yes, I said, I'm your dad. But where have you been? She asked, and the question hit me like a physical blow. I didn't know about you, I said, choosing my words carefully. Your mom and I, we had some problems when you were very little, and we lost touch with each other. I only found out about you a few weeks ago. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Didn't you want to know about me? Oh, sweetheart, I said, reaching over to take her small hand in mine. I wanted to know about you more than anything in the world. I just didn't know you existed. But now that I do, I'm never going anywhere again. To my amazement, Emma smiled. Good, she said. I like having you around. You bring better art supplies than Mom does. It was such a perfectly childlike response that I found myself laughing despite the emotional weight of the moment. Leave it to a 12-year-old to focus on the practical benefits of suddenly acquiring a father. Over the following weeks, Emma and I developed the relationship I wished we'd been building for her entire life. She told me about school and her friends and the teacher who made learning fun even when she was too sick to attend classes regularly. I told her about my work, about Grace, about the life I'd built that now had room for the most important person I'd never known was missing from it. The medical updates were encouraging. Emma was responding well to treatment, and her doctors were optimistic about her prognosis. The financial burden that had driven Janet to seek my help was being managed through the payment plan I'd established, and Emma's care was no longer threatened by unpaid bills. But the emotional complexity of the situation was far from resolved. Janet and I still had to find a way to co-parent a daughter we both loved, while navigating the minefield of our shared history. Grace had to adjust to the reality that our quiet life together now included a teenage stepdaughter with ongoing medical needs. And Emma had to adapt to having a father she'd never known she had. One evening, several months after Emma's treatment had begun showing real progress, I found myself alone with Janet in the hospital cafeteria. We'd been avoiding private conversations, but Emma was having a good day and had specifically requested that we both go get her ice cream while she rested. She looks good, Janet said, breaking the silence between us. She does, I agreed. The doctors seem pleased with how she's responding. Janet nodded, then looked down at her hands. I know you'll probably never forgive me for keeping her from you, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that watching you with her these past few months, seeing how much you love her, it's made me realize just how much I cost both of you by being a coward. I looked at this woman who had been such a central figure in both the best and worst periods of my life. She was right that I might never fully forgive her for the years she'd stolen from Emma and me. But seeing her now, exhausted from months of worry about her daughter, genuinely remorseful about the choices she'd made, I found that some of my anger had transformed into something more like pity. Emma is what matters now, I said finally. Whatever happened between us, however many mistakes we've both made, she's the priority. Everything else is just background noise. Janet nodded, wiping away tears she probably thought I couldn't see. She loves you, you know. She lights up every time you walk into the room. She's an amazing kid, I said. You did something right, raising her. It was the closest thing to forgiveness I could offer, and we both knew it. As Emma's treatment continued and her health improved, we settled into a routine that worked for all of us. I visited the hospital several times a week, bringing books and art supplies and stories about the projects I was working on. Grace joined me sometimes, and she and Emma bonded over a shared love of mystery novels and terrible puns. Janet and I learned to communicate like the co-parents we'd suddenly become, focused on Emma's needs rather than our own complicated history. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of everything we'd left unsaid threatened to derail our fragile cooperation. But we managed it for Emma's sake. The day Emma was finally discharged from the hospital for the last time was one of the best days of my life. Her cancer was in remission, her strength was returning, and her doctors were confident that she would continue to recover. As we walked out of the building together, Emma, between Janet and me, chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to do now that she was feeling better, I realized that our unconventional family had somehow found its footing. Dad, Emma said, tugging on my sleeve as we reached the parking lot. Can we go see those mountains I drew? The ones with the lake where you can see all the stars? I looked at Janet, who nodded with a smile. I think that sounds like a perfect celebration, I said. Can Grace come too? Emma asked. I'm sure she'd love to, I replied, already planning the camping trip that would mark Emma's full recovery and our family's new beginning. As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about the email that had started this entire journey. Janet reaching out after 15 years of silence, asking for help I'd never expected to give. The anger and betrayal I'd felt seemed insignificant now compared to the gift that had emerged from that moment of desperation. I had a daughter, a smart, funny, resilient daughter who'd taught me that love could grow in the most unexpected circumstances. The past would always be complicated, full of choices we couldn't undo and words we couldn't take back. But the future was wide open, full of camping trips and art projects and bedtime stories I'd never had the chance to read. When I walked into the house Grace and I had built together, she was waiting for me with that smile that had made me believe in second chances all those years ago. "How's our girl?" she asked, because that's what Emma had become to both of us. Our girl, our family, our unexpected blessing. "She's perfect," I said, pulling Grace into a hug that felt like coming home. "And she wants to go camping to see the stars." "Then we'd better start planning," Grace said, because that's the kind of woman she was. Always ready to make room for more love, more family, more possibilities than we'd dared to imagine. That night, as I lay in bed thinking about everything that had brought us to this moment, I realized that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the greatest gifts. Janet's lies had cost us years we could never recover, but they'd also preserved Emma's innocence and given us the chance to build our relationship on a foundation of choice rather than obligation. I was a father now, in ways I'd never expected to be. Not just because of biology, but because I'd chosen to step up when Emma needed me most. She'd chosen to accept me as her dad, despite the strange circumstances of our introduction. And Grace had chosen to welcome both of us into the life we'd built together. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities I was still learning to imagine. School events and teenage drama and college applications and all the ordinary miracles of watching a child grow up. I'd missed the first 12 years of Emma's life, but I was determined not to miss another day. Sometimes second chances come disguised as disasters, wrapped in the very pain we've spent years trying to escape. But if you're brave enough to look past the hurt and grab hold of the love that's waiting underneath, you might discover that the life you never planned is exactly the life you were meant to live. Emma was coming home from the hospital tomorrow, and Grace was making her favorite cookies to celebrate. We were planning a camping trip to see the stars, and Emma was already working on drawings of what she imagined we'd find there. The past was finally where it belonged, behind us, and the future was bright with promise. I was a father, a husband, a man who'd learned that forgiveness isn't always about the person who wronged you. Sometimes it's about making room in your heart for the love you never knew you were missing. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that love comes with art supplies and terrible puns and the chance to count stars with the most important person you never knew existed.